Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I love fall so much. It's one of the shortest seasons here in Colorado, which makes it extra special. My kids love all the fall decorations, and there are pumpkins literally everywhere. So in the spirit of fall today, we're going to paint some pumpkins. If you want to follow along, I've included a list of all my supplies in the description below, as well as a link to the reference photo from Unsplash. I'm using 6 colors: Gamboge Nova, Transparent Orange, Scarlet Lake, Transparent Brown Oxide, Indigo, and Turquoise Blue, which is totally an optional color. You'll need a couple of water jars, paper towel, some watercolor brushes, and of course, watercolor paper. I'm using the Strathmore 500 series 140-pound cold-pressed cotton watercolor paper today. I've taped on the sides with washi tape to help prevent warping and buckling, and I've already sketched on my design. Now, I did modify the design from the original photo. I just brought the pumpkins closer together and tightly cropped them in, and I'm simplifying the background and leaving out those pine cones. Start by grabbing a large round brush and dip it in clean water. We're going to be doing multiple layers of wet and wet to create all these different transparent layers of color on the pumpkin. For now, paint with the clean water all around the center of the pumpkin, since that's going to be a totally different color. When you're applying your water, be careful that no puddles or pools are forming. We're going to start with the Gamboge Nova. This is a warm sunflower yellow color, and just drop it into the pumpkin, wet and wet. It's really important to control how much water is in your brush when you're using this technique. Otherwise, you may end up with some excess pooling or puddling, and the colors will just kind of stay in one puddle or spot, and you don't want that. You want the color to softly spread throughout the wet paper. Avoid any highlights for now with your yellow. You can see I'm painting around some of the brighter areas on the pumpkin and not letting my paint touch those little spots. We're painting right up to the center. Now rinse that out, and if any of your highlights got covered up, you can take a clean, damp brush and gently lift those right back out. We're going to do the second pumpkin the exact same way, so start with your clean water and wet the area first, and then drop in your first layer of yellow. I like to start with the edges just to get those nice and clean and really perfect. And of course, we're doing this the same way, avoiding those highlights, painting around them carefully. The second pumpkin actually doesn't have quite as many highlights in it as the first one, so always be looking at your reference photo for guidance on areas of light and shadow. Just fill in the entire pumpkin yellow except for those highlights and let them dry completely. Once your first layer is dry, you can start the second layer exactly the same way as the first. Now, it is so important to let it dry completely before re-wetting, otherwise you may end up accidentally lifting your previous layer, so be careful for that. But apply clean water all over your pumpkin once again, and this time take your second color. We're taking Transparent Orange, removing any excess water and gently dropping it into the pumpkin. Now is your chance on the second layer to have a little more fun with your values. To make your values lighter, all you need to do is add a little more water to your paint, but always be removing any excess water from your brush before applying it to the painting. On the bottom side of the pumpkin, you can see the shadows are a bit darker, so you can be more generous with how much pigment is in your brush for those areas. It's a lot of fun creating these gentle striations through the pumpkin. Watch your reference photo and carefully soften any hard edges as they form. But if you're painting on a wet surface like this, your paint should really soften quite naturally. In the center of the pumpkin, there's a dark cast shadow, so I'm completely filling that in with the orange. I'm painting with a darker color in the center of each of those little ridges or valleys in the pumpkin. And where the pumpkin flares out and is in the light a little bit more, I have a more watered down version of my Transparent Orange. In the shadow area, I'm using a much darker version of the orange on the bottom side here. And you can see it's really starting to help our pumpkin look more 3D as we add this second layer with more midtones and a variety of lights and darks within these shapes. Once you've gone over the entire pumpkin, some of the areas may have already dried, so you can go back in and darken even more with your Transparent Orange. So this is technically a third layer. The pumpkin is still somewhat damp, so our edges are softening slightly, but not nearly as much as they did at the beginning when the paper was much more wet. Really quick, if you feel like maybe this tutorial is moving a little too fast, good news, it is available in real time. Just head over to emilyolsonart.com where you can become a member of my Watercolor Mastery membership. With your membership, you'll have access to over 100 fully narrated real-time tutorials like this one, and they all come with a downloadable reference photo, line drawing, and a complete list of supplies used in the video. I'll leave a link in the description so you guys can check that out. All right, let's get back to the video. Now paint your second pumpkin the exact same way, applying clean water first all over the pumpkin. Make sure there are no pools or puddling. Switch brushes to your paintbrush. I like to use my Silver Black Velvet size 8 round brush and apply a generous amount of transparent orange everywhere you see those darker ridges within the pumpkin, softening any edges by gently removing some paint from your brush and then swiping along those dark edges to create a lighter value so that the pumpkin looks like it's turning from dark to light within each little shape. Carefully avoid those highlights, and if a furry or fuzzy effect occurs, you can gently soften that by swiping along it with a clean, damp brush. You can speed up the drying process with a heat tool such as a hair dryer, and then you're ready to begin the third layer. By now you might be seeing a pattern here. We're going to do the exact same technique again. This time we're going to use Scarlet Lake. This is a beautiful red color. It's a warm red, which means it's a little more orangey rather than purple. And we're using this to darken and boost those shadow shapes inside the pumpkin even more. Be a little more sparing with your red than you were with orange. This is just going to be applied to all of your darkest shadow areas. Where you want to use it in a lighter value, of course, you can dilute the color with a little bit of water. But you can see as we're adding this third layer, it's really helping boost that orange, and it's really making our shadows look even more three-dimensional. Apply a generous amount, especially on the bottom where the shadows are the darkest, and then to soften your edges, lightly remove some of your paint on your paper towel and swipe along that edge. It's so important to control how much water is in your brush. If you do have too much water in your brush, it's going to cause a mess on your paper, and it will cause the paint to be pushed aside, creating this cauliflower or bloom effect, and we don't really want that on our pumpkins here today. Darken each little crease within the pumpkin, and then soften those edges. Now, I'm going to play around with a little bit of my transparent brown oxide to see if I can apply this wet and wet to the red. And if it's a little bit too dry already, you can save it for the next layer. So we're moving on to the second pumpkin and painting it the same way with layer number 3 using Scarlet Lake. If you don't have Scarlet Lake, you can use any warm red such as cadmium red light or some other warm red that you might have in your palette. Paint each little crease and soften your edges as much as possible. Notice I don't scrub and I'm not aggressive with my brush strokes. I'm painting very lightly with a feathering motion most of the time unless I want to paint a broader section. Dry that layer and then let's begin the fourth layer. We're working the same way, wet and wet, re-wetting the entire pumpkin. For this layer, we're going to use transparent brown oxide to darken the shadows even more. You can see I'm being even more sparing with the brown than I was with the red, applying it only to the darkest shadow shapes. Transparent brown oxide is somewhat of a granulating color, so if you see a little bit of a pebbly or sandy texture in this paint, don't be surprised. That's just the nature of the paint. On the top side of this pumpkin, there is a dark shadow, so I'm painting that in with the brown and then trying to soften each edge. You can see now with this fourth layer, we're really beginning to get a strong sense of the pumpkin's shape, and it's literally popping off the page. This is a really exciting stage in the painting. So if your painting isn't looking great yet, don't worry. Just see it through to the end and you'll be amazed at what you can achieve. We're going to paint the second pumpkin again the same way. Now I approached this one a little bit different. I did start with the transparent brown oxide, and it's quite dark on this pumpkin, especially in the far right corner. I applied the brown to all of the creases, but then I realized that this pumpkin needed a little more yellow, so I'm going back in with my Gamboge Nova. This is the color we used at the very beginning, and I'm painting over the entire pumpkin except for the highlights using another layer of my warm yellow. Ultimately, I think this helped it look so much more like an accurate color for a pumpkin, and I was really happy with how this layer of yellow looked across the top. Be careful to paint around your highlights once again, but if you do accidentally cover those up, you can also lift those at the end if you'd like. With the wet layer of yellow on my pumpkin, I could go back in with brown and it softens really nicely, wet and wet, into the yellow layer. You can see the difference between the two pumpkins. So to balance that out, I'm going back into my first pumpkin and adding another layer of Gamboge Nova. This can actually be done wet on dry if you prefer. When you do a layer of wet on dry, however, you do need to be more intentional about softening each paint stroke as you lay it down. This just requires dabbing your brush on a paper towel or removing a little bit of it with the water and then softening along the edge that you just laid down. As we add this layer of yellow, you can see it's really beginning to match the pumpkin on the right. Once again, paint carefully around your highlights so that they look really brilliantly lit. On the pumpkin over here, I'm removing some of our highlights back out as it got a little bit covered up. You can just take a clean, damp brush and gently scrub those out. Now for the center of the pumpkins, I'm using that turquoise blue. This is a really cool or almost greenish blue, and I've diluted it quite a bit with water, and I'm just painting all of the shadow areas, just avoiding a couple of pure white highlights where I'm allowing the paper to show through. Dry those pumpkins completely, and then we're going to go in with our final layer on the pumpkins. This is Indigo. Before we go on, if you guys are enjoying this video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It's totally free. When you subscribe, you'll be the first to know whenever I drop a new video, so go ahead and do that right now. Indigo in its purest form is almost black, and it's a perfect color for all of the shadows inside of the stem of the pumpkin. For this technique, I am using dry brush, which means I'm painting with wet paint on dry paper. You can even allow your brush to scrape across the surface to create some of that bumpy looking texture in the center of the pumpkin. I'm painting in the dark corner and then using the same technique on the other pumpkin. Do observe your reference photo, however, since both pumpkins will be slightly different from each other and you don't want them to look exactly identical. So look for little differences and try to include those to make each pumpkin beautiful and unique. You may have noticed I switched to a smaller brush. I'm now using a silver black velvet size 4 round brush and a very tiny little brush stroke to increase those creases in the pumpkin. Now finally for the background, I'm using wet and wet, and I'm just alternating between indigo and transparent brown oxide. You can see when you apply lots of water to the background, those colors just explode on the paper and it looks really soft and blended. I worked in 2 sections, doing the bottom left first and then the bottom right corner after that, so that I didn't have to worry about painting everything all at once. I added a couple of blooms and then I tightened up my edges. Now I wasn't happy with how blotchy it looked when I dried it, so I decided to go in and add a second layer wet and wet. The advantage to doing this is that you already have some paint on your paper, and when you reactivate or wet it with clean water, the colors will naturally soften together a little bit more, and you can scrub gently to create more of the shape that you're looking for in your background. So the second layer I thought turned out much better in the end. Use your heat tool to dry it if you'd like to speed up the process, and then remove your tape to reveal beautiful, perfect borders. There's our finished pumpkin painting. Thanks for watching, guys. This was so much fun to paint. I hope you'll tag me on Instagram if you decide to try it. Check out these other videos about watercolor painting, and I'll see you there.